Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. I'm Tim Boehm. Tonight we're taking a deeper look at the court ruling upholding North Carolina's new congressional and legislative maps. It's not the end of the road, as the decision is already going to be appealed, but the more than 250-page ruling gives us a lot to break down and think about it. For more on all this, we welcome on a panel of experts, Dr. Michael Bitzer, professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Dr. Whitney Manzo is an associate professor of political science at Meredith College. Asher Hillenbrand is a professor of politics and public policy at Duke University. Alfredo Rodriguez is the founder and president of Dice Communications, a Republican consulting firm based in Charlotte, but he's here in Raleigh with me tonight. Good to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a few pages to digest, and I know Dr. Bitzer stayed up all night long to read every single word, and he went on a tweet storm this morning. What stands out to you the most?
Well, I think certainly the general impetus is that the courts have said, this is not for us to decide. I think that's kind of, if you boil it down, what it feels like is that they were making a decision to not make a decision, that it was a political question best left up to the legislature. However, in that 260 pages that you mentioned, they mentioned the phrase intentional pro-Republican partisan redistricting over 50 times. They described all 14 congressional districts as intentional pro-Republican partisan redistricting. They labeled 23 out of the 50 Senate districts and 53 out of the 120 House districts as being intentional pro-Republican partisan redistricting. So at times it felt like we're making the case and we've seen the evidence, but we're just basically going to defer and let somebody else decide at this moment.
Meaning the state Supreme Court, who will likely take this up. All right, Alfredo, so the court rules in your favor, not yours personally, but your party, and says, look, the maps are constitutional, but they're partisan. You good with that?
I am. I've said this before on the show, North Carolina redistricting is a deja vu moment. I mean, it seems that, every time there's a redistricting case, Democrats and partisan organizations like Eric Holder's, want to challenge the maps in the court. This does no justice to the candidates who are running for office. It does no justice to the voters who want to elect representatives to the General Assembly and Congress. And, they were fair. The process was fair, and the maps are fair, and we should just move on.
That's not going to be the case, but that's a nice Asher, what do you make of this? I mean, this is an interesting court ruling. It's unanimous, by the way, at this level. It is obviously now going to go to the Supreme Court, but is it the legislature's prerogative, and is partisan okay?
Well, what's interesting about this ruling is, for those of us who have been following this issue for a while, there were a lot of echoes to the Supreme Court's 2019 partisan gerrymandering decision, also out of North Carolina, claiming that extreme partisan gerrymandering is bad for democracy, but outside the purview of the courts, when in fact the courts have regularly asserted their constitutional authority to restrain other forms of discriminatory gerrymandering, claiming that no standards exist with which to judge when gerrymandering is too extreme, when in fact the plaintiffs in this case and in many others have provided a variety of different analytical tools with which to make those judgments. And this is especially ironic since the Supreme Court's decision concluded by reassuring us that state courts could take on this issue. And after that, a state court in North Carolina responded by doing exactly that, producing the relatively fairer maps used in 2020, which were accepted by Republicans and Democrats at the time. So there was plenty of precedent for this panel to act, and it's unfortunate that it declined to do so.
Dr. Manzo, I think a lot of people are assuming, look, it's a 4-3 Democratic court on the state Supreme Court that's going to be overturned. Is that a fair assessment for people to make? I know people in the judicial system don't want to hear that because they think that they're, impartial in what they do, but is it fair that we think that might happen?
Oh, definitely. And that was going to be my response to what Asher said as well, is that, Michael, to the distinction that the courts are trying to draw here between what's political and what's judicial is entirely made up, and it moves based on issue to issue. So they'll decide one time to take the case and rule in it. They'll decide another time to take the case and decline to rule. Other times not to take the case at all. And there's no consistent rhyme or reason here. And so I think it definitely makes sense for people to assume that a state Supreme Court that's a majority Democratic will rule in favor of the Democrats.
Dr. Bitzer, just before you all came on, the House Speaker said, it was not extreme gerrymandering, that this is based on where people live. And if you look at the map and where people live, the map makes sense, that there's nothing extreme about it. Does he have a point?
I think he has a point about how North Carolina has basically sorted itself. Republicans will hammer on the fact that great numbers of Democrats reside in urban counties like Wake County, like Mecklenburg County. But in some of the research that I've done, if you look statewide and break it down to precinct level dynamics, we are seeing over 70% of all the precincts across the state having voted for one party or the other by 60% or more. So yes, we are sorting ourselves, but where you place the district lines matters a great deal in terms of the dynamics of how that district will ultimately, potentially perform politically.
All right, Alfredo. What about this whole next argument about whether some of these justices should recuse themselves? There's arguments on this on both sides. Do you think these are legitimate potentially, or the court should just stay in place the way it is for this case?
We know that North Carolina is a very partisan state. It has been for the last, decade, maybe even 2 decades. Our judicial elections are partisan now. As a result, I fully expect that the North Carolina Supreme Court, with a majority of Democrats, are going to make some changes to these maps. Whether or not you recuse some justices or not, elections have consequences, campaigns matter, and they won out on the last elections. I think things will be entirely different after the next Supreme Court elections.
Which will be this year, so we'll
That's
see
right.
some of that. Asher, let's say the court does choose to overturn these maps, then the argument or debate or results of what we see is how they would get redrawn again, whether it goes back to the legislature or a special master or something else. What do you think about that? Keeping in mind, I asked Speaker Moore this question earlier, and he said the court should have no business in this. It's the legislature's duty only. So what do you think about that?
Well, there are plenty of options available to the court. One is to order that the legislature come back to redraw the maps according to some criteria to be more fair on a partisan basis or less discriminatory. They can appoint, as you say, what's called a special master, who's an expert that is appointed to draw the maps. But there's also a middle option where they say to the legislature, we're going to give you a shot at this to do it right, but we're also going to appoint a special master and have that person waiting just in case you don't. And given the time frame we're operating on, the State Board of Elections has said that by February 18th, it needs to know the district lines for the new primary date. We've got to get candidate filing concluded. So I think that anything the court does must make clear to the General Assembly that we're not going to wait around for this. You've got to get it right, or we're going to turn to somebody else.
Dr. Benzo, part of the problem here with this too is we just don't have a clear set of criteria. We've been adding to them, and I say we, the courts and even the legislature in some ways have done that, but we're never going to, that seems to be a moving target in some ways, which makes this difficult even for a court to decide, right?
Oh, definitely. Sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Benzo.
I think it was.
Go ahead.
I think definitely that the courts have moved the goalposts several times, move them forward, move them back. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It depends on who's on the court and the political considerations that they're taking into account, even though the judges will always swear that they're not doing that.
Oh, I know. Justice Bob Orr comes on the show all the time. He gets so mad when I talk about justice as being partisan, but it is the nature of where we are. Dr. Bitzer, go ahead. You were going to say something too on it.
Well, I think we can just look back to the Stevenson case, which had a huge impact in terms of the state legislative districts and the map drawing process there. There, the Supreme Court, under a Republican Chief Justice, was very clear in terms of these are the conditions and the criteria and the process by which the legislature needs to redraw the maps. So yes, the courts are willing to insert themselves. You know, we get into this partisan back and forth of who should have ultimate control. And in this lower court decision, they were distinctly saying it is up to the legislature. We are a legislative supremacy state, but there are some dynamics that perhaps could influence the courts to say, but you need to take these things into consideration.
Asher, you mentioned about that date that the Board of Elections needs to. If they overturn these maps, I don't see how they do a May 17th primary. Do you?
I think it would still be possible to keep the primary where it is. The timing will be tight. But we've got a real team of professionals at the Board of Elections. As long as they get what they need in time, they're able to get it done. So I think we can still stick to that time frame, but we don't have much time to waste, and that's why the Supreme Court issued the time frame it did for this case. I expect we'll see it before the Supreme Court in pretty short order, and hopefully we'll have a ruling that allows not just the General Assembly to draw better maps, but also give certainty and stability for voters in North Carolina.
Well, and candidates. Alfredo, you work with candidates. You do this for a living. How challenging has it been trying to plan for this year?
It's been very challenging. Like I said before, I think the most important thing that needs to be considered here is that elected representatives have drawn maps, which is constitutionally afforded to them, and now we have to wait and continue to go through court cases whether or not these maps are going to be fair, whether or not they're going to be overturned, and candidates and voters have a great deal of uncertainty in front of them.
Dr. Manzo, are we going to be having this segment again 10 years from now or like 6 months from now?
Can I say both? Because that's my response.
And maybe a year from now and 2 years from now. Oh my goodness. It's a lot for everybody to take in, but we appreciate all your expertise to let our viewers have a better understanding of it. We will see what happens. Thank you. In the meantime, we are out of time for tonight. As always, if it's on Jones Street or Main Street, you'll find it right here in Capitol tonight. Stay safe, look after each other. Of course, we'll see you right back here tomorrow night.